Good afternoon and good morning, perhaps. My name is Clarissa Alcantara, and I'm the Director of Education for Justice. If you're not familiar with Education for Justice, it is a library of sorts. It's a Catholic social teaching database with more than about 2,000 resources. And we have resources that you can use in your parish, in your school. We have a lot of material for high school, high schools and colleges, stuff that you can use in campus ministry. Education for Justice is about 20 years old. We were born out of the Center of Concern, where we started, and several years ago, the Ignatian Solidarity Network, about 4 years ago, Ignatian Solidarity Network, when Center of Concern had closed, we took it over. And so I've been the director here as Education for Justice for going on 3 years. And a couple things about Education for Justice as we're getting started. We are offering a discount code for those of you who want to kind of try it out and perhaps even participate in a demo of our site. One of the things that we've got going in the next couple of weeks is what we're calling our virtual IFTJ, where high schools from across the country will be invited to participate in our virtual webinar offerings around migration, environmental justice, advocacy, and more. And I'll drop some links in the chat for you to kind of check out. And our, I wouldn't say agenda for today, but our time today will be spent majority with Julie. And after she concludes, we're going to leave some time for Q&A. A number of you have submitted questions for Julie to kind of answer. And so we're going to read from that sheet first, and feel free throughout the presentation to type questions in the chat. And then we're going to end our time with a really beautiful examen that was written by both Julie and Jordan. And away we go. If you do need technical support, myself and one of my colleagues, Brenna Davis, will be on the call. So if you do need something, we are going to be monitoring the chat throughout. Again, please leave your mics on mute. There will be Q&A time at the end. And with that, I will introduce Julie and read her bio, and away we go. Thanks for your patience. I am pulling it up. All right. Julie Schumacher-Cohen is a member of the Catholic Advisory Council of Churches for Middle East Peace, a Washington, D.C. based coalition of church bodies where she previously served as deputy director. She serves as well on the board of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She is also Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs at the University of Scranton, where she works on civic engagement, economic justice, and refugee solidarity initiatives. Julie holds an MPA from Villanova University and is currently pursuing a PhD in political science at Temple University, where she focuses on issues of religion and politics, foreign policy, polarization and conflict, and territorial rights. Long involved with Israel-Palestine peace-building efforts, Julie is the daughter of an Israeli, has family in Tel Aviv, and has traveled and studied in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, learning from Palestinians. So with that, I offer a warm welcome to Julie Schumacher-Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. And let me just share my screen here. Make sure that's working. Yes. Okay. So thank you, Clarissa, for hosting the webinar today. I'm really appreciative to the Ignatian Solidarity Network for making these issues of justice and peace in Palestine and Israel a part of your work. We know that too often there's been a Palestine exception in social justice efforts, whether we look broadly or within the Catholic and Jesuit network. So ISN is really playing such an important role, and I just appreciate your support, Clarissa, and your team at ISN. So thanks also for the introduction. I will be talking quite a bit from the work that I do as a member of the Catholic Advisory Council of Churches for Middle East Peace. And you mentioned my personal connection. So I'm Catholic. I'm the daughter of an Israeli with Jewish-Israeli family in Tel Aviv, and really deeply influenced by Palestinian Christians. And this started from a college study abroad semester 20 years ago, in terms of having a professor from a Palestinian Catholic sociologist who helped to really broaden my lens to understand the Palestinian narrative and experience, and to put me on a journey of learning and unlearning on Palestine that continues today, including through my doctoral work. Ahead of the webinar, I was in touch with colleagues, Palestinians and Israelis on the ground, so I'll be sharing some of the feedback from them along the way as well. What we wanted to do today was to talk about the very fragile Gaza ceasefire, kind of where we are right now. I have also, of course, been taking in the news of the last 24 hours, and so we'll also be talking about what was a very shocking proposal by President Trump last night regarding Gaza, and kind of bring us up to the moment. But then I want to step back, and we'll be referencing the backgrounder that I co-authored with Dr. Jordan Denari-Duffner. She and I have worked collaboratively in many ways over the last year and a half. And that was kind of subtitled After October 7th and in the Shadow of the Gaza Catastrophe. So we're trying to review this past year, help us to assess what's happened in light of Catholic social teaching, and how we can be mindful of our core values and how we address Israel-Palestine. So let's see here. Okay. So the Gaza ceasefire. So I put up here on the slides some of the main asks that came out of the Catholic letter on Israel-Palestine. Some of you may recall that. You may have signed that. That was an initiative of the Catholic Advisory Council of CMEP. And we issued that last May in 2024. And I always share with people that we did not believe that that letter and its asks would be relevant throughout 2024. And in fact, it was relevant up until just a couple of weeks ago, and it still remains relevant. But I have next to it, some of the sort of breakdown of the phases of the ceasefire, and then this news of Trump's announcement in regard to Gaza. So just a little bit on what is the ceasefire? What does it look like? Where do we stand now? It was first announced on January 15th, and it went into effect on the 19th, so it's only been a couple of weeks. It played out as a kind of political football between the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. The deal that's in effect right now is largely the one that was worked out back in May 2024, but which President Biden never used his leverage to really bring to fruition. And then we know from various reports that President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, did help it bring it over the finish line. But as we saw yesterday in the meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's no real clear commitment to the ceasefire progressing. And in fact, this announcement by Trump really took the pressure, or sort of the focus, off the ceasefire, which is problematic. So as you may have seen in the headlines, he laid out what I would characterize as a preposterous, illegal, and dehumanizing proposal to have Palestinians be relocated out of Gaza, which is tantamount to ethnic cleansing and a violation of the Geneva Conventions, and then have the U.S. Take ownership of Gaza, which is really a euphemism for an unlawful occupation, which the U.S., of course, has done in other parts of the Middle East in the past. What level of seriousness there is to this is not clear. It was 4 a.m. in Saudi Arabia, and they issued a statement right away saying that they reject this they're supporting a Palestinian state. And yet we still have to take it seriously and to be very much concerned and in opposition to it. Prime Minister Netanyahu did stand there and reacted positively. He even said it's something that could change history. That kind of reaction has been fairly broad across the Israeli political spectrum. So some are also saying this is kind of an opening negotiating position on the part of Trump, and maybe even a way to stall reconstruction in Gaza. So I'm going to come back to this as we go through the presentation, and especially as we talk about the impact of U.S. policy. But so back to the ceasefire itself. Right now, it's a temporary ceasefire, and we were calling, of course, for a permanent ceasefire. It is a phased approach, meaning that it's a release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, withdrawal of Israeli military forces so that Palestinians can also return to different parts of Gaza. And we have been seeing that happen in fits and starts. And there have also been breaches in the ceasefire, including Palestinian civilians that have been killed by the Israeli military. A very important and a very positive development is that there's been a significant increase in the humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. And according to the World Food Program, more food has been delivered in the first 4 days of the ceasefire than in any given month during the war. So we have to be really clear on what that reveals. Israeli human rights colleague Tanya Hari, she works at an organization called Gisha, that works on Gaza access issues, and she told me that there's a clear indication that it was always possible for Israel to ensure the entry and coordination of more aid. So we can conclude that the withholding of humanitarian aid was a political choice on the part of Israel. And also, there's a lot of supplies and things that are still not getting into Gaza. There's essential supplies like tents that are needed that are still not reaching northern Gaza. So even though that those borders and those crossings do seem to be more open, there's still more to come on that. There were also statements by Israeli officials, including Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich, that he has assurances from Prime Minister Netanyahu that the ceasefire is a way for Israel to bring back the hostages and then resume the war, resume what has been called a genocide. And we actually saw very little substantive talk about the ceasefire last night, which may serve Netanyahu's kind of political interests. Of critical concern also is that even if the ceasefire lasts, there's no vision for leadership transition and especially Palestinian political unification in Gaza. And as one human rights colleague shared with me, that means that Israel can continue using Hamas as an excuse to close or fragment and fire on Gaza. So again, we're in a very tenuous situation. And then another important thing about this current moment is the situation of UNRWA. So that's the UN agency that serves Palestine refugees. The Israeli Knesset had voted to ban this agency, and that has just come into effect. The U.S. government, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, we're currently not funding UNRWA. They are a critical part of any humanitarian response. So that is really problematic. The U.S. needs to restore its funding, and also to understand that there's been an effort for a long time on the part of various Israeli officials to kind of denigrate the agency and by doing that to remove the Palestinian refugee issue as a political issue and to deny Palestinians a right to self-determination kind of in that process. So to keep an eye on UNRWA, and there should be a bill reintroduced in Congress called the UNRWA Emergency Funding Restoration Act. That will be something to be talking to our members of Congress about. So there's a lot of political dynamics, and again, I'll kind of come back to that at different points, but I also want to just take stock of the human dimension of the ceasefire of this moment, especially the moments of joy that it has elicited. So we've seen Israeli families reuniting with the hostages that have been released. We've seen Palestinian families reuniting with prisoners released. Of course, we've seen a halt to the bombs in Gaza, and this was actually a video of the children kind of just erupting in joy when the announcement of the ceasefire came through. And then on the right, as many of you know, Pope Francis has called the church in northern Gaza for the past 15 months every night. And so here, this was on January 20th, he's asking them, what did you eat today? And they were sharing about how they had chicken for dinner because obviously more food is able to get in now. It's also important to note that while the joy of the Israeli hostage families is widely shared in the media, including in the US media, the joy of Palestinians is policed formally by Israeli authorities. And we also don't see that nearly as much, I think, as well in our US media. And then the joy is also mixed with sadness. We can imagine the kind of human suffering and destruction that could have been prevented if a ceasefire had been achieved earlier. It's really important to take stock and recall that Pope Francis called for a ceasefire beginning October 29th, 2023. So this has been a long time. Jordan and I actually met first in person when we went down to the White House with a group of Catholics on November 2nd, 2023, to petition President Biden, then, of course, only our second Catholic president, to work for a ceasefire. But his administration would go on to veto multiple ceasefire resolutions at the UN that fall and continuing, and then send more and more arms to Israel with no conditions. So that kind of brings us up to the current moment. So I want to segue now into discussing some of the highlights of this backgrounder that we created, and then and helping us again to kind of look back on last year, think about where we are now, and then some of these core themes based in Catholic social teaching. I also want to note that while we're focusing on the ramifications of this last year, so the horrific attack by Hamas on October 7th, the ensuing genocidal military assault by Israel on Gaza, but it's really important to recall, and we do this in the backgrounder, that Israel-Palestine did not begin on October 7th, 2023. It did not emerge from an otherwise peaceful context. Prior to October 7th, Gaza was already under blockade by Israel and Egypt since 2007. Of course, the Palestinian population in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza have been under Israeli military occupation since 1967. So, this kind of underlying situation of Palestinians lacking the basic human and civil rights that are available to Jewish Israelis, the need for Palestinian freedom and for Palestinian human rights. These are systemic injustices that remain unresolved and are at a root cause of violence and instability. So while I'm not going to be getting as much into the sort of history today, our previous backgrounder and a webinar that Jordan did last year does touch on the history a little bit more, but we wanted to foreground this. This is not just a year and a half, issue. So what did we grounded the backgrounder and really all the work that we do, and obviously for many of you is the same, is the work is the inherent dignity of each human person and the Catholic teaching on that, and to take seriously to really grieve the thousands of sacred lives lost that in the Holy Land this past year, and to really and so we recalled in particular four instances that were meaningful to us, and you all can think of people that whose faces and stories that you've been attuned to, but I'll tell you a little bit about the four in this, or more than four, but the pictures that you're seeing on the screen. So on the top left is Hind Rajab. She is the 5-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed in Gaza by Israeli forces on January 29th, 2024, along with 6 family members and 2 paramedics who were trying to rescue her. On the bottom left is Isar and Asal Abu al-Qumsan. They were twin newborn Palestinian babies who were killed on August 13th in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza, and their father who discovered them dead after returning home with their birth certificates. On the top right is Israeli hostage Hersh Goldberg-Polin. He was kidnapped on October 7th and killed on August 31st in Hamas captivity. You may recall that his parents were global advocates for diplomacy and a hostage deal. And then Dina Darwish, a Lebanese aid worker, and her youngest son, Jad, who were killed by an Israeli missile in eastern Lebanon on September 23rd. I'm not going to talk very much about the regional dynamics today, but of course, there's also a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. So secondly, we sought to really attend to the realities on the ground. So particularly the catastrophe in Gaza. And I want to spend a couple of minutes or a few minutes on the entrenched occupation in the West Bank, because that's not breaking through the news cycle right now. Well, of course, our news cycle between our US politics is very difficult to break through, but it's really important to talk about what's happening in the West Bank. So we will do that. A lot of you are familiar what has happened in Gaza, but I do want to review and just really take stock of the devastation that has occurred. So Israel's massive bombardment has really decimated most of Gaza's civilian infrastructure. This was not a narrow or targeted campaign against Hamas militants. The health and education sectors have largely collapsed. 66% of structures, including more than 220,000 homes, 68% of road networks, and for all of us who are connected to education, all 12 universities are damaged or destroyed. At the height of the hostilities, 1.9 million Palestinians, so 90% of the population, were forcibly displaced. So we're hearing all of this about forcible displacement out of Gaza. Gazans were already forcibly displaced within Gaza. Evacuation orders by Israel covered 86% of Gaza at the height. 47,000 Palestinians were killed. That's a very conservative estimate that most people think is going to rise. 100,000 people wounded, 38,000 children orphaned, and as many as 33,000 with permanent disabilities. Catholic Relief Services reported in the fall that Gazans were facing crisis levels of hunger. We know that has at least hopefully somewhat relieved, but also lacking clean water and sanitation, and that is going to take a lot longer to be able to resolve. A testimonial that was recorded by Israeli human rights group B'Tselem described northern Gaza as, quote, no longer fit for human habitation. So again, when we hear from President Trump about how Gaza is uninhabitable, sadly, that is accurate. But what he's offering, of course, are not humane solutions. And he's also not taking any of the blame onto the US or Israel, but rather only blaming Hamas and other actors. Many Palestinians describe what's happening as an ongoing or a second Nakba. You may be familiar with that term. That's the Arabic word for catastrophe, and it refers to 1948 when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes or left their homes when the state of Israel was established and they were never able to return. 80% of Gazans are 1948 refugees or their descendants. So again, this kind of cycle and pattern. And of course, now with what Trump's plan, it could be like a continuation again or a third Nakba. Again, I don't think that that's going to happen. It relies on all of us to make sure that that does not happen. I wanted to spend a couple minutes specifically on the churches in northern Gaza, and it was in touch with some of the contacts who are in touch with the Christians there. So the photo on the left is Catholic Patriarch Pizzabella. He was able to get into Gaza in July, and he's surveying damage to one of the Catholic schools in that photo. And then the middle photo is just from a couple days ago in northern Gaza around where the churches are located. And then the one on the right is from a video taken by the Catholic priest, Father Romanelli. So if you've ever seen the videos of Pope Francis, he's usually talking to Father Romanelli. You might see some of the parishioners. And so this is from a 5-minute video where he's driving around northern Gaza, this sort of just horrible landscape around him. And then he's reciting the rosary and the sorrowful mysteries. So you can see at the bottom, it says, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. And you can look him up. He's on Facebook, and he's just started his own YouTube page, I believe. So, but the Palestinian Christians in those churches in northern Gaza have now emerged. So like all Palestinians, they're trying to return to their homes, and they're finding that their homes are either no longer there, not livable, and that the necessary infrastructure is not in place. So the Holy Family Catholic Church itself is still intact and is likely to remain a place of refuge for those individuals, Christians and Muslims, for the foreseeable future. And it's important to underscore, as I mentioned earlier, that this ceasefire has brought a mixture of joy and also extreme disappointment and sadness, because people are taking in destruction in areas that they hadn't been able to go to for months and months. Nobody could move around from that compound. You may recall 2 of the women in the compound had tried to walk around or kind of go from place to place, and they were killed by Israeli snipers. So people could not get from the church back to their homes. And yet, as I heard from a colleague at the Latin Patriarchate, which is the Catholic Church kind of office in the Holy Land, there is this real spirit of resistance to despair, of resilience, which is common of all Palestinians, and a commitment to rebuild, which will need the support, of course, from American Catholics and the international community. And as of this morning, upon hearing President Trump's announcements, there was a Gazan Christian who responded saying, "We are not leaving. We're not going to leave Gaza. We're going to remain here." So moving to the West Bank. So one thing my colleagues stressed is that it's been a terrible year for the West Bank, even though the focus has been on Gaza. There was already lots of increases in settler violence and demolitions of Palestinian homes, of annexation of Palestinian land by Israeli authorities. But when the ceasefire took effect in Gaza, there was a movement then for focusing by the Israeli army on the West Bank, and also more and more activity by settlers. And so they're calling it a kind of Gazification of the West Bank. One friend described it as pure hell in most areas. So you're seeing on the left, settlers are attacking Palestinian villages. In the middle and the right are some of these different closures, gates, all different kinds of restrictions that are making freedom of movement within the West Bank nearly impossible. So that means that families can't get to schools, they can't get to work, can't visit other parts of the West Bank very easily. On the right is this kind of interminable type of traffic jam that people can be stuck in. Colleagues at the Caritas Baby Hospital in the West Bank have relayed that fewer children are able to reach the hospital than before. Another colleague described this as, quote, a policy of pushing people to the limits. So thinking that Palestinians will just carry their luggage and leave. And he said, some will leave, the rest will stay, and some will explode. And this is a sentiment that I also heard from Palestinian colleagues when I was last in the West Bank in spring of 2023. So this was months before October 7th. And this sense that this deepening oppression of Israel's military occupation was making nonviolent resistance seem increasingly futile, even as they remained committed to it. And during that same visit I had with me my teenage son, who had never been to the West Bank. And after just a half a day of being in Bethlehem with all of the walls and the checkpoints, and he turned to me and said, "Mom, this is like living in a prison." And so again, every report is indicating that this has gotten much, much worse. And the picture on the bottom is not of Gaza, it's of the West Bank, and it's of the Jenin refugee camp. So a similar approach in terms of Israel's a kind of attacks or assaults on Gaza, we're seeing now playing out in the West Bank. So what can we do about all of this? How do we assess all of this? What can we do to bring justice to the situation? And one thing we thought was important in the backgrounder was to spend some time on thinking about how do we as Catholics understand international law and universal human rights, and especially in relation to Israel-Palestine. The late Jesuit Father Drew Christensen, some of you may be familiar with his work. He was a mentor to me, and he started the Catholic Advisory Council of CMAP And he wrote quite a bit about international law and how Catholics should think about it. He said that the, quote, the Catholic commitment to international law rises out of the belief that the human race is one family under God. And he believed it was particularly important in situations of inequality, so such that exist between Israel-Palestine, because it, quote, helps rectify the imbalance of power between actors. So it's a really important tool for Palestinians who live under, military rule in terms of, or other types of unjust rule in Israel-Palestine, depending on where they're living. And they're not on the same standing, and they're not equal actors in terms of how Israel and Palestine interact. So this is an important tool to seek accountability and justice for all parties. So Palestinian Pope Francis made headlines in the fall because of a new book that came out in November, where he referenced experts' findings and urged further investigation into whether Israel's Gaza military campaign constitutes a genocide. So just to kind of review some of the important kind of milestones of last year in terms of international bodies looking at Israel-Palestine and trying to understand again what was happening, how to bring justice, how to bring accountability. So well known, the International Court of Justice, this is now over a year ago, in January, ruled that Palestinians' rights to be protected from genocide were plausibly at risk, and that Israel should take steps to prevent genocide. In May, they specifically called for Israel to halt the offensive in Rafah. That had also been something that President Biden, the Biden administration, had been calling for, but they backed away from that, and Israel went forward anyway. And then in the meantime, Amnesty International has concluded that Israel's actions constituted genocide, that it did not narrowly target Hamas, but rather engaged in these indiscriminate attacks. Other scholars have also talked about, have looked at this. And so Amos Goldberg is a prominent Holocaust scholar, and he said what is happening in Gaza is a genocide because Gaza does not exist anymore. Another opinion in terms of the international bodies that didn't get as much attention was the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, viewing that as unlawful and illegal. And that also follows on the body of work by various human rights groups that have identified Israel's systems of control, whether in the occupied territories or throughout Israel-Palestine, as akin to an apartheid system. And this is important because of what's coming, I think, in terms of the West Bank. And then in May of 2024, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, brought charges of war crimes against both groups, so Hamas officials for crimes of killing civilians and hostage taking on October 7th, and Israeli officials for the military campaign in Gaza. It's important to note that all the Palestinian militant leaders that were cited by the ICC have all been killed. So they've all been assassinated or killed by the Israeli military. So these kinds of pathways for justice and accountability are not being utilized. And in many cases, they're actually being openly flouted or undermined. So just last week in Congress, the Senate narrowly blocked a Republican-led effort to sanction the ICC in protest of its arrest warrants for Israeli officials. And whereas Prime Minister Netanyahu has been cautious about traveling to some European countries, he had no concern about coming here to the United States. He was, of course, warmly welcomed. The US and Israel are not members of the ICC, but the US has praised the ICC when it's been sort of, when it's been judging more its adversaries versus its allies. So in the case of its actions with Russia's Vladimir Putin, as an example. Also, for those of you who are interested in the analysis of Gaza in light of just war theory, there was a July report of the Justice and Peace Commission of the Holy Land that concluded that, quote, neither the attacks by Hamas nor Israel's devastating war in response satisfy the criteria for just war according to Catholic doctrine. And we do link to that. So that may be a useful educational tool, depending on if you're where you're, what discipline or if you're teaching on it. So I wanted to come back to U.S. policy again. A lot has happened in the last 24 hours, and just highlight that, for a long time, U.S. policy has not been particularly even-handed or fair, even though we have an important role as being a broker on Israel-Palestine. We're often the ones who are bringing the parties together, but presidents of both political parties have generally strongly backed Israel's policies and approach and sidelined Palestinian aims and goals. I'm calling in today from Scranton, of course, which is President Biden's birthplace. He's known to be someone who's very warm interpersonally, who grieves with those who have lost family, like he did in his own personal story. But in my observation of what had been going on about a year ago, I wrote this article saying President Biden is known for his empathy. I pray it will extend to Palestinians. So we never saw that. He was never able to conjure up empathy for Palestinians in the way that he did very thoughtfully and very authentically, I think, for Israelis and Jewish Israelis. So that not only the sort of interpersonal impact of that, but the policy impact of not valuing Israeli and Palestinian lives equally. So other than delaying one arms shipment, the Biden administration never meaningfully conditioned or halted U.S. arms to Israel, despite clear violations of international and U.S. law over the course of the last year. And some of you may be familiar with, in particular, the U.S. law, which is the Leahy Law, which prohibits U.S. military aid from being provided to foreign security forces that are alleged to have committed human rights abuses, and in particular, if they have obstructed humanitarian aid. And as I mentioned at the beginning, according to various groups, yes, we can see now for sure, if we weren't already clear before, that there has been obstruction of humanitarian aid by Israel to get into Gaza. Israel could also not have perpetrated the assault on Gaza without U.S. arms. The U.S. supplies more than 65% of Israel's weapons. The other two countries are Germany and Italy. But as I stated earlier, the outlook for the Trump administration is fairly alarming. We did already know from his first administration that he held a lot of anti-Palestinian views and approaches. You might recall, he unilaterally moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and this headline is saying, that was for the evangelicals. His vice president at the time, Mike Pence, was very strongly kind of in the Christian Zionist evangelical camp. He had also halted funded for Palestinians. He pursued the Abraham Accord. So this idea that Israel can make peace with an Arab state in a bilateral way, but ignore the peace with the Palestinians. And President Biden continued that. And actually right before October 7th, they were continuing to work on the Israel-Saudi deal, again, without really bringing the Palestinians in. Now, again, Saudi Arabia, I think, is in a position now to potentially really hopefully put pressure against some of these kinds of policies that Trump is proposing, but that's what we'll have to see and look for in the coming weeks and months. In his first couple of weeks, Trump has lifted the sanctions. So this was a positive thing that the Biden administration had done. They had placed sanctions on Israeli settlers who had clearly done violence against Palestinians and were not being punished also by the Israeli government. But he lifted those. And also Trump, as we know, in the last couple of days, he's made these kind of bold statements about Gaza being a, quote, massive demolition site or, quote, a pile of rubble. On a certain level, he's stating the obvious in a way that the Biden administration had not been willing to do. But his plans that he's announcing are, just cruel, illegal, again, kind of preposterous to remove Palestinians and to occupy Gaza by the United States. It is important also to note, I had mentioned earlier that Netanyahu was standing there while he's making these claims. He has seemed open to this kind of ethnic cleansing plan. There have been various Israeli officials who had openly called for that over the past 15 months. And there was a recent survey that 8 out of 10 Jewish Israelis support some kind of a plan to expel Palestinians from Gaza in one way or another. So sadly, that is not a completely fringe view within the Israeli political scene. Regarding the West Bank, Trump was asked about that. President Trump was asked about that last night. He didn't give a clear answer. He said they're looking at it. They're going to be coming up with their views on that in the coming weeks. But when we look at who he has in his cabinet or in his sort of in some of his leadership, we can see some real kind of red flags. So his proposed U.S. ambassador to Israel is Mike Huckabee, who is an avowed Christian Zionist evangelical. He has said that Israel has, quote, title deed to Judea and Samaria. He always uses the biblical terms for the West Bank. And then President Trump's appointee as the UN ambassador, Representative Elise Stefanik, she in a hearing recently was asked, and she said, yes, I agree that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. So that is, again, this what's happening in the West Bank is going to be very important to keep an eye on. And altogether, I would say these are really dire times for U.S. policy toward Palestine and Israel. And that is also true for students and for the kind of college campus context. That's not new. As of the Trump administration, there was already a lot of pushback and kind of not support for the expression that was happening through the protests on college campuses last year. We wanted to highlight in the backgrounder how, of course, that manifested also on Jesuit campuses. And so these are photos from across the Jesuit network, the University of Scranton, Loyola Marymount, Fordham University. And they were joining their voices to, the college students across the country who were raising up this issue of Gaza and the U.S. Support for what was happening. And I think in our context, we can really see that they were following the Jesuit ideals of social justice activism, but not necessarily supported or encouraged, and in various cases across the country, again, really many sanctioned and punished. And to kind of bring it back into our Jesuit tradition, I think we can make a lot of parallels between the calls for a more just and informed U.S. policy and a halt of arms to Israel in terms of what Father Ignacio Ellacuría was doing when he came to the United States in 1982. He gave that famous speech, and in it, he called for a more just and informed U.S. policy toward El Salvador, because at that time, the United States was supporting a very right-wing government in El Salvador, and this current Israeli government is its most far-right government in history. They were engaged in human rights abuses, and the U.S. was supporting that government with military aid. And I've talked to Salvadoran colleagues, and they've said we didn't get to the end of that civil war until the U.S. withdrew the military aid, and that sadly did not happen right away after Father Ellacuría's visit, but it took the killing of the Jesuits and the real uprising of advocacy for that to end up coming into play. The students were also calling for divestment, so also aligning with what we can see as the call from Father Arrupe in terms of drawing no profit whatever from clearly unjust sources. And so again, seeing how these kinds of efforts on campuses, really connect to our Jesuit and Catholic traditions. But I do want to raise some new kind of alarming developments in terms of the campus environment. So it's been a real flurry, obviously, in terms of executive orders that the Trump administration has introduced. So you may not have seen it, it hasn't gained as much attention, but there is an executive order to revoke student visas for foreign students who participated in pro-Palestine protests. So kind of part of a larger deportation policies that we're seeing on the part of the Trump administration. The EO equates the protesters with, quote, Hamas sympathizers, and describes the movement generally as anti-Jewish and anti-American. And I pulled this picture out because I thought it was very kind of, visual. A Palestinian scholar, Jihad Abu Salim, is saying uncomfortable on campus. He's kind of critiquing this kind of effort of positing who is in fact uncomfortable on campus when in Gaza, there are no functioning universities. On the right is a statement from Rabbis for Ceasefire. They were a group that came together again over the last year and a half. They're opposed to this EO, and they're particularly pointing out, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this real dangerous conflation that has been taking place between anti-Semitism and critiques of Israel. And I view this as a conflation that really undermines the ongoing fight against anti-Semitism. We know that there is very much still contempt of Jews that exists, but we need to be clear about what anti-Semitism is, and not to conflate it with critiques of Israel. So this is a whole development that needs to be really looked at and opposed. There is no student that I'm aware of yet that has kind of come under this executive order, but we'll have to keep an eye on it in the coming weeks. So I want to conclude and get to your questions by just kind of rounding up the ways in which we have tried to apply Catholic social teaching and Jesuit social justice tenets and core values to the Israel-Palestine dynamic. And so I started off with talking about our responsibility to uphold the human dignity of both Palestinians and Israelis. And that really is a contrast to what we so often see as a rampant devaluing of Palestinian lives in US discourse and policy. And of course, that was really peaked again last night with this idea that Palestinians are just going to be forcibly removed by the millions to another location. But it means drawing close to the pain and anguish of Palestinians and Israelis, and really rejecting that dehumanization, which did not start last night, but has been there for a long time, and an ethic that relies on military force and violence. And in the center of the slide is a stone from a farm called the Tent of Nations. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's right outside of Bethlehem. It's the property of a Palestinian Christian family. They have long resisted encroachment by Israeli settlers. They have constant court dates that sometimes get postponed. They're often sending out updates. It's extremely frustrating. And yet, they're just trying to remain on their land. But even with all those challenges, this is the rock that greets you as you enter the farm. We refuse to be enemies. So again, looking for examples and models and people that can inspire us. And then obviously the preferential option for the poor, and very important teaching in terms of how do we think about that for Israel-Palestine. So obviously it means to address systemic injustices and go to those most on the margins. And I think that means advocating for Palestinian rights and for Palestinian freedom. That's a missing link that we don't have. It's an underlying root cause. But then also understanding that ending the occupation and ending oppression is entirely consistent with a commitment to ensuring the safety and dignity of Jewish Israelis. And I speak as somebody who has family living there, and I see that the liberation of Palestinians and Jewish Israeli safety are intertwined. And this photo on the left here of Pope Francis, so he was, I forget what year this was, but it was a few years ago. He had gone to the Holy Land, and this was apparently an impromptu stop where he stopped and put his hand on the wall in Bethlehem and wanted to draw close to that. And yet he's also an example of someone who has never left, who's not leaving anyone out. So we can draw close to that, the pain of that systemic injustice of walls and checkpoints and occupation, while still seeing a just and peaceful future for both peoples. And then subsidiarity, so hearing from those most affected by an issue on the ground. And on the right is a sign at a Bethlehem NGO called WEAM. They do a lot of work to transform conflict. And they're saying here, come, see, and act. And sometimes it's also followed by go and tell. So this idea of come, hear, listen to Palestinian Christians, visit also with Palestinian and Israeli human rights activists. Those are communities that I'm also very inspired by. And then have that transform you and then bring that back. Now, of course, we've had a struggle to be able to travel in the same way. So many study abroad experiences have been canceled. But even if we can't resume travel, we can have other ways of connecting. There's many different podcasts and webinars and ways to connect with people on the ground. And then solidarity, which of course calls us to accompany Palestinians and Israelis on the path to justice and peace and to work for the common good. And the picture on the bottom right is a solidarity effort where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims came together around another Palestinian Christian family, also in the Bethlehem area, the Kasia family. They are in the village of Al-Markrur, and they have also, their land has been taken over by settlers and Israeli authorities. And so this was really an effort to help them save their land and remain on their land. So, and then lastly, this idea that solidarity requires us to use our voice. And the statement in which is, a while ago now, but last March was very important, that was issued by the global Jesuits saying, we can't be silent on Gaza. And that is still completely relevant. We are going to continue to need to raise our voices among all the different issues that are in front of us right now and to push for a permanent ceasefire. And then just lastly, just two more points about, there's a lot of pitfalls that can happen in terms of, or sort of potential pitfalls in terms of Israel-Palestine advocacy. So this is just some kind of guidance a little bit in terms of how to think about engaging in these issues. So there can be a temptation to not take sides, but at the same time, we have to recall and be attentive, can't be neutral in the face of injustice. It's not really an option for people who are wanting to be engaged as peacemakers. There's also often an approach of kind of both sidesism, so whereby both groups are equally faulted. It doesn't mean that there aren't faults on the part of Israel and Palestinians and the Hamas and the Israeli government, but it means that you can't ignore the asymmetries of power in which one country, Israel, is the occupying power. And so this reflection is from the emeritus Palestinian Catholic Patriarch Michel Sabah, and he's talking about how we have to actively take sides, the side of justice and peace, freedom and equality, and then this idea that we need to recognize the root cause, which he describes as the negation of the right of the Palestinian people to live in its land free and equal. And then I've touched a little bit already on anti-Semitism and how do we address it, and then thinking about all of these issues of bigotry. So anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian bigotry. Father David Neuhaus is an excellent resource. He's writing very, very often. He's an Israeli Jesuit, and he's talking in this quote about this struggle to find a way to explain what anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are, how they can be both real but also instrumentalized or weaponized, and then try to find a way that puts us all together on the sort of the same side of the barricade and struggling against them. And I thought that was a really helpful visual, because sometimes they're sort of posited as different things. So in terms of anti-Semitism, thinking about how we can work to obviously reject it, also recognizing the role that the Catholic Church has played in historic Jewish persecution. Some Christians can, really wrongly blame all Jews for the actions of the Israeli government. That really has to, that's really a mistaken kind of approach. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at the same time, recognizing that opposing Israeli policies, critiquing the political ideology of Zionism should not be conflated with anti-Semitism, and it should not be, that should not, charges of anti-Semitism in that way shouldn't be used to delegitimize the struggle for Palestinian human rights. And then in terms of Islamophobia, also, of course, working against it, recognizing that Catholics have also contributed to negative associations with Islam, and then reflecting too that one of the reasons that Palestinians are so dehumanized often in US discourse and policy often connects to Islamophobia. And then again, thinking about how Catholics have played a role. You may recall this story. It's a long time ago now, but there was a young Palestinian boy in Chicago who was killed not long after October 7th by his Catholic landlord. So, making sure that in the work that we're doing, there's no place for stereotyping or collective blaming, and to be on guard for manifestations of hate that can come into different movements, and to be sure that if you see that kind of thing, to really be making sure that that's being called out, or having conversations with people about that. So to finish, I wanted to give a couple of actionable things in terms of what you can do. So obviously education, many of you are in that role. There's lots of ways to bring speakers onto campus, to use the resources that ISM has, building awareness, being really meaningful about prayer and the sacred lives that have been lost. And we're going to, I think, use the Examen today when we close. But then also advocacy. And I know that obviously right now there's going to be a lot of issues that crowd our attention, but just to kind of review what I talked about as far as some of the core issues that are coming up right now with US policy. So first of all, to make sure that we're moving and progressing through the phases of the ceasefire and not getting stuck on the first phase. That's really a real danger right now. And again, all the emphasis last night now is on this news, and we've kind of lost sight of that. So we need a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, but also really a ceasefire in the West Bank too, because of how things have spread now. To continue to work to withhold military assistance to Israel as long as those weapons could be used in violation of US or international humanitarian law, as I talked about, which we saw happening last year. To find ways to support UNRWA. There's US organizations that support them. You can contribute to them. And then broadly, the rebuilding of Gaza, which of course is going to take many years, to be strongly opposing any kind of effort to ethnically cleanse, to forcibly remove Palestinians from Gaza, and to find ways, of course, for Palestinians to remain in Gaza and to be there with dignity. And this is a real challenge, because I think what's really difficult about what's actually coming out in the last 24 hours, again, is that Gaza really is largely destroyed. And so many of the things that people need to live with dignity and to raise their children are not existing. And so how can we make it so that people can stay and be safe and be healthy? And then also in terms of settler impunity, so these sanctions that have been lifted, this is a really dangerous moment for Palestinians in the West Bank, and to oppose the annexation of the West Bank by Israel. That would really be there's already been for many years, there's been analysis around, is the two-state solution dead or still alive or still possible or not? Well, the annexation of the West Bank would make that completely impossible, to the extent that it isn't already potentially not possible. And then this kind of broader goal of a just peace for all in the Holy Land. There's right now in Israel-Palestine, there's 7 million Palestinians and there's 7 million Jewish Israelis. And nobody should be forcibly removed. Obviously, the biggest danger right now would be for the people in Gaza. But for both peoples to be able to live there with equality and dignity and safety, and to find a way forward. There still may be opportunities to participate in divestment. Many of our schools already, many Jesuit institutions and lots of different institutions have social investment policies. So looking for ways to include these issues as part of that. Laudato Si also called for ethical investment. So again, looking for ways to be sure that we're not supporting things that are impacting, negatively Palestinians on the ground. And especially, I think, this coming year, the efforts to fundraise for Gaza humanitarian aid. You may find particular organizations that you want to connect with, that you want to give to, and also Palestinian Christian groups, but also Palestinian and Israeli peace and human rights groups. I mentioned that Clarissa mentioned that I'm on the board of Foundation for Middle East Peace, and we give grants to these groups, and many of them have lost funding. There's been a environment of political repression within Israel that has made that work even more difficult. There's not funding within Palestinian civil society to keep these groups up. So again, another source of need that exists. So I think that these are just some other resources. So CMAP, the Catholic Advisory Council, I think we're going to have a page soon. A Foundation for Middle East Peace. They have an excellent podcast called Occupied Thoughts that has really great speakers all the time. Also another podcast called Across the Divide that explores the intersection of Christian faith and social justice. And they have just finished a series on Christian Zionism. So if you want to dig into what that looks like and what some of the leaders in the Trump administration may be coming out of, that's another helpful resource as well. And with that, I am happy to take questions. So Clarissa, I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time, your sharing of knowledge, your kind of engagement in this space, and allowing us to kind of share a little bit more. Just like for brief background, the way this came together, if you're interested, and it's always interesting, like, in terms of timing, is we had a resource about a year ago, Education for Justice Tries to Respond to the Signs of the Times. And I had seen Julie at a conference over the summer in Chicago. And I was like, hey, Julie, like, can we revisit this topic when you have time, and so she created the Education for Justice resource at the end of the semester, like late fall, early winter. And we were editing it really briefly in early January, and the news of the ceasefire kind of came about. And like, that's kind of what led us to this moment and kind of the re-invitation to engage in this. And so that's just one example. I'm going to plug Education for Justice because that's kind of who's sponsoring today, but that certainly is one example of how we at Education for Justice desire to respond authentically to the signs of the times and create resources and materials that are not only timely, but kind of bring in the fold and the different information. And so really in a lot of ways, we've kind of been going back and forth on this, I don't know, for several months. And so thank you again for that commitment. A number of you submitted questions, and I very much appreciate that. So I've got a Google Doc I'm looking at for all of that. And I'm going to ask my colleague Brenna to drop in the Examen that we're going to be using in a little bit to close our time. And then we'll drop it now, and then we'll kind of share it, and we'll lead you through that. And if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. We'll do as much as we can in the 17 or so-ish minutes that we've got left. So first question, in challenging religious Zionism, to what extent can we ask for leadership from bishops? Or do we need to be much more proactive as laity?
So I mentioned the Catholic letter on Israel-Palestine at the start, and that was signed by some bishops, not a large number, I think around 5 bishops. And then it was signed by thousands of other Catholics, so academics and leaders of institutions and clergy and other members of religious orders, and then lots of laity. So I think the bishops absolutely have a role. There's and even in recent days, as we know, on issues of migration, there's been a lot of insertion of what is Catholic social teaching on these issues. So we need that voice. And I think that voice needs to continue to be, we can hear more from the bishops, I think, on Israel-Palestine. That's not been a huge focus. But also I think all of us have a role to play. Obviously, groups like Ignatian Solidarity Network, you all coming here today have different connections, whether through your parish or whether through educational institutions. So I would say, yes, continue push for the bishops to make Israel-Palestine even more of a priority, but also find whatever role you can in terms of, hopefully, you feel that what we try to present in the way that Jordan and I have done this work, and others again in the Catholic space, that this is compelling, that we can use Catholic social teaching and the Jesuit social justice tradition to engage meaningfully on Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. In the spirit of solidarity, how can we engage our Jewish and Muslim neighbors in the pursuit of a just peace in Israel?
So I did, along the way, mention a number of organizations, Israeli human rights organizations. There is an Israeli peace movement. It's not a very large or necessarily powerful group of people, but they're an important voice. And so I think following different organizations, I mentioned B'Tselem, there's Yesh Din, there's Breaking the Silence. There's a kind of whole system of groups there. There's also a group called Standing Together that's Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel who work together within Israel. They've been on the forefront of calling for a ceasefire. So there are examples like that you can, when you're engaging with your Jewish and Muslim counterparts, to be able to point to, we don't only need to go to sort of the voices or the positions that are, at total odds. There are people who can see a vision for a joint future in that land where Israelis and Palestinians can live with equality. It's very far from what's happening right now on the ground. It's very far from U.S. policy. But at the same time, I think that it's possible. And certainly there are groups working for it. So that's one of the ways that I think is helpful is to, I mentioned Rabbis for Ceasefire. If not now, there's a lot of groups within the American Jewish community, Palestinian American community. So looking for those voices and hopefully helping that to have the conversation. I saw that there was, I think, another question around sort of dialogue and how do we engage in dialogue. It's obviously very difficult, to be trying to listen, trying to be sure that you are listening to people and taking the information in and responding with, with as much compassion and as you can, and also recognizing that there are times where there's a limit to dialogue, and there are times where we need to be advocates and we need to be engaged in various ways in peaceful protest, and so there's can be a place for dialogue, and there can be a place for other kinds of activism, and sometimes they can't always happen at the very same moment. But I also think that having those hard conversations can also inform your work as an advocate.
Speaking of informing work, what are some news agencies that are maybe the most trustworthy for news on the situation in the Gaza and West Bank?
Yeah, so it is really important to go beyond just U.S. media. There's a magazine or kind of an online news magazine called 972 that has a lot of Palestinian and Israeli reporters and voices on the ground. Another group is called Just Vision. The Foundation for Middle East Peace, so fmep.org, they do a weekly roundup. And so it's articles from across the region. And again, you're going to get things that go beyond our kind of US media scape. And then Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, you will see a lot of conversations in that newspaper that you don't see within our own US media. So I would also encourage that. You do have to have a subscription to get most of their online news. And then also, many of you may be familiar, especially if you're active on like Instagram, there's been a lot of independent journalists and voices coming directly from Palestine. And I think kind of cutting through that, one person I follow is the Palestinian poet, Mossab Abu Toha. He's reporting constantly. He was exiled from Gaza, but he's getting reports all the time, and he shares that on all of his platforms. So I think finding ways to find trusted voices that can also cut through and make sure that you're getting news that you might not see, if, for instance, in the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. What assistance or help is there for the 38,000 orphan children you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that are working on the ground. I mentioned Caritas Baby Hospital. They're located in the West Bank, and of course, geographically, that they're completely cut off from each other. So there's Medical Aid for Palestinians. That's an organization that works in Gaza. There's ANIRA, the Association for Near East. I forget what they stand for, but they have roots in the U.S. too. So they're working. So there's a lot of humanitarian groups. I don't know if it's going to be one particular effort. I know many Palestinian families have taken in these orphans already, so people are absorbing the children into their families, but that of course is also a burden and a challenge. So that's why I think the need to fundraise, the need to, you can also donate directly to the Latin Patriarchates, of which is, it's a funny terminology, but it's just the Catholic Church in the Holy Land. They have a way to give money on their website because they're going to be one of the main ways that the churches rebuild in northern Gaza and repair these schools and other ways that they're giving assistance. So those are a couple of, but I don't know of any one particular effort that's looking at the issue like holistically, but it's a staggering number.
Great. For those of you who are interested, I found the Instagram of Mossab Abu Toha, and I typed it in the chat if you're on Instagram. A question that was submitted: if current approaches have yielded limited success, what radical new ways of thinking and acting are necessary to break the cycle of violence and injustice?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of there's been sort of a rigidity around sort of the two-state solution, and is it happening or isn't it happening, and or can it happen or can it not happen? I think one of the insights that some of the Catholic leaders in the Holy Land have also put forward, and Palestinian Christians and Palestinians and Israeli human rights groups, so again, not just from any one group, is that whatever happens, there has to be the baseline of equality for Palestinians and for Israelis. We cannot have a hierarchy of rights. There can, and currently there is. And again, I say this as someone who has Jewish Israeli background. Wherever I might go in Israel-Palestine, I'm going to have more rights than Palestinians do. And I'm saying this as someone who's an American, like I'm not living as an Israeli citizen in Israel. And so we need to break that hierarchy down, whether it's through a binational state or a confederation. There's an interesting project called Land for All that people can look up that is kind of getting into this imagination about what things could look like that could be different. But I think really focusing on values, so like the value of equality, and that be applied to all people in the land.
Great, thank you. Going back to the Google Doc, let's see. You did talk a little bit about how to kind of have conversations, but to kind of dig a little deeper, how can this be sensitively and honestly addressed with how can we sensitively and honestly address the conflict with Palestinian, Muslim, and Jewish students in class together? Like any ideas or yeah.
Yeah. So there are different, I know I don't teach a class currently on Israel-Palestine at the University of Scranton, but I have come in to do different kinds of like guest lectures and things. I think you have a lot of opportunity to bring in guest lectures. So bring in, Palestinians, bring in Israelis, bring in Jewish voices. My own view is that while it's important to be exposed to various voices and we can read different takes on things, it's also okay for for those of us at, again, Jesuit institutions and with the Catholic teaching to be kind of affirming the fact that we do have a position, meaning that we're not for instance, Trump's plan of ethnic cleansing. We have not been for what's happening in Gaza. So kind of like, yes, we need to expose our students to multiple viewpoints, but also, yes, we also have at least some view toward equality and justice and peace for both peoples, which is radically different than what we're seeing. And I think we can think of this as in a model for, when we talk about immigration issues. The Catholic Church is not neutral on immigration. We can certainly hear different voices on immigration, and we hear them all the time right now in the discourse about, we don't need to be, we need to reject and close our borders. But at the end of the day, we're going to have resources that we can provide in a class that is going to, put forward a different kind of a message in terms of Catholic social teaching. So there's lots of resources. One professor, Mira Sukharov, she does a lot of work. She's a Jewish Canadian political scientist. She's part of the Land for All initiative. We had her and Omar Dajani, so he's a Palestinian legal scholar. So I think it is important for people to be able to see that there are Israelis and Palestinians who can see a vision forward. So if you can bring those kinds of voices into your classroom, or find people on, there's lots of recorded presentations that you can also bring into the classroom as well. And also, I think just being realistic that this is an issue that has caused a lot of difficulties in interfaith relationships, in personal relationships, and just being serious about that. It's not the only issue that's done that's where that's true. Trying to be steadfast and be, committed to trying to work through relationships, but also understanding where there can just be really real differences. And I do run dialogues at the University of Scranton as part of my civic engagement work. And many of us have tools too, where you can set up a space in the class where you use a communication agreement, where people feel that they can share, where it's not going to be taken out of context or kind of taken out of the classroom. So they might be willing to share their views a little bit more openly than they might do in other settings. So again, many of us have those kinds of programs on campus, but you might be able to, view something or get some different perspectives and then use a kind of dialogue or sort of civic dialogue model for how the students then discuss it in small groups.
Fantastic. We've got time for one last question. For those of us in institutions with subgroups, that take annual trips to Israel, how can we understand and talk about that with community members?
Yes, I was on a call earlier about this. So there's a lot of problematic pilgrimages that go to the Holy Land that really view the Holy Land only through a kind of spiritual lens and kind of don't engage politically. That I think that's really not being true to the call to understand the social realities that we are surrounded with. So I think if you're in a role to be able to impact that, to ask if you're going on something, asking questions, am I going to be going to the West Bank? Am I going to be meeting with Palestinians? Am I going to be connecting with Palestinian Christians? And making sure that you're not only, sometimes groups come, they go to they go to Bethlehem and they literally, and I've been in Bethlehem and seen this, they're on a bus, they drive right to the Church of the Nativity, they go out, they go in for a few minutes and they drive right back out. They don't stay in Bethlehem, they don't support the tourism sector there. They don't support the local Christians. They don't even meet the local Christians. So we really need to change that. And I think it's on all of us who are in conversation or part of those kinds of trips to make sure that they are getting experiences where they're, again, connecting with the Christian community, connecting with Palestinians, connecting with this Israeli human rights and peace community. And there's a lot of different groups that run trips now. I used to work also for a group called the Telos Group. They run trips of different, which again combine and bring in different narratives, but with a clear sort of perspective of peace building and of peace and justice. And then also Friends of Sabeel, they do various trips. So there are resources out there, but we really can't take these trips that are, kind of trying to only take a spiritual sort of historical sense of this is where Jesus walked. I think if Jesus were walking in Israel-Palestine today, he would be in pain and anguish. And we need to be able to kind of model that in the way that we take those trips today.
Wow. Thank you so much. What I wanted to do was leave time for our examen. So thank you again for answering the questions and kind of what the knowledge that you've shared. I want to invite us, one of the great gifts and joys of Education for Justice is people come to us all the time for our prayers. This is like our #1 search thing on our website. And I thought it would be fitting to kind of end with an examen that was written by Julie and Jordan. So thank you for that. And so I'm going to invite you in this next part. And if you've never done an examen, it'll take just a few brief moments. I'm going to read some text. I'm going to leave some time for you to reflect and engage. We certainly heard a lot today. Some of it was new. I imagine some of it touched our hearts. Some of it will continue to transform us as we chew on it, as we think about it, as we continue to go about our days. And so in the next few moments, if you want, feel free to turn off your camera if it's not already off. If you think it's odd that people are staring at you while you pray, I invite you to take some cleansing breaths, turn off your camera, and then we'll begin the group examen. Become aware of God's presence. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and hold in your heart and mind one or more of the individuals who were killed this past year in Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. Sacred life ended too soon. The scale of suffering can bring anger and sadness, despondency, and even despair. Be still and recognize that God is present in these spaces of pain and hardship. Review. Take a moment to consider the information you know about the Gaza crisis, the broader Israel-Palestine and regional contexts, and the information you learned from this backgrounder and webinar. Was there something that helped you understand a particular issue better? An insight or point of clarity or consolation? Pay attention. Consider what is going on in your thoughts, your words, and body as you think about the Holy Land. What do you find most challenging? What brings you desolation? Choose one feature and pray from it. Identify a thought that you heard, an image that was shared on screen, or a feeling that you can't leave behind as you think about Gaza, Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. Pray with it. Is there something you can do to affect it? Are you being called to further prayer, education, and/or action? Remember that God is at work in you and the world. Look toward tomorrow with hope. Palestinian Christians often discuss the Palestinian practice of Samud, which means steadfastness. In remaining in the Holy Land, in resistance to occupation and oppression. As you look toward the future, meditate on where you find hope. From Palestinian Christians, Palestinian and Israeli human rights and peace activists or others. Follow their example. Amen. What a wonderful way to kind of just end our time together. Looking forward to tomorrow, offering reflection, kind of really taking that time. So once again, thank you so much. We're just about time. After today, we are going to send out the webinar once, Zoom is done processing it. I'll send out the Examen again. I'll send out the Education for Justice information if you want demo material, promotion code, all that good stuff. Thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Clarissa. Thanks for everyone for joining.